Hi, everyone. It's me again, Abe Barge with Community Planning and Development. I was involved with the original project to create the framework that allows short-term rentals in Denver that was adopted by City Council several years ago. As you know, that system emphasizes licensing of short-term rentals, which is why Erica and her team are mostly who you're talking to at this point. But also there had to be a change in the zoning code as part of that because the zoning code had previously not allowed short-term rentals. And so a change was made to allow them accessory to primary residential uses, with the licensing taking care of most of the other requirements that you all talk about. But we had pretty robust discussion last time about just zoning questions and suggestions for how things could be different in the future. There is no specific plan to update the zoning to do something different with short-term rentals, but I think one of the purposes of this this committee is just to track the things that we should be aware of in case we do need to propose to make changes. Erica, were there specific questions or items that you wanted to start out with, or do you want to just open it up?
Sorry, I was muted. I was just going to open it up. I know we had several members at the end of last meeting who still had questions. So if you've been hanging on to one of those since our August meeting, feel free to just jump right in, and we'll try to take them in order. If you want to raise your hand, I'll try to keep track of the order that people are raising their hand in, and maybe that would help keep some order. So that said, does anyone want to go first?
I've got a relatively basic one. What differentiates a duplex from an internal ADU?
Sure, thanks, David. And that's kind of related to the question that you asked by email. I'm sorry I haven't answered it yet. Also mentioned that several of you wrote to me after the last meeting with some additional questions and also just interest in being involved in the residential infill project that we talked about. Sorry, I've been really swamped and haven't responded to most of those messages. It's all still on the radar though. So apologize for that. But back to your question, David. So basically this comes down to what is a primary dwelling unit and what is an accessory dwelling unit. And primary dwelling unit is the easiest thing to understand, like a completely independent dwelling unit that doesn't necessarily have any special relationship to any other dwelling unit. Meaning, in primary dwelling units include like condos or apartments in a big building, even though they're all in the same building. No one of the units has any special relationship to any other unit, which is not true of accessory dwelling units, which are created via a different permitting path, which is basically you've got a primary dwelling unit. And in some zone districts, not all single unit zone districts permit this, but the ones that do, you have the opportunity to actually create another unit that, for all intents and purposes can, have many of the same features as a primary dwelling unit, a bathroom and a kitchen, for example, but get it permitted as an accessory dwelling unit. And when you do that, there's a lot of additional restrictions that it has on it, because generally speaking, you're doing that in a single unit residential district that wouldn't permit you to create another primary dwelling unit on the same zone lot. But you could create a basement apartment in some of those districts. And so you're limited in terms of the square footage. There's an important limitation, which is that the ownership is the same and that the owner lives in the primary dwelling unit. And so it's like a much more restricted type of dwelling unit. So when you come back around to the difference, really, it comes down to how was it permitted? And I think we talked about this a little bit last time, is that there may be an opportunity in some cases to permit something differently than how it was permitted in the past. So let's say you've got 2 units in an existing structure, and it's just an old, a big old house in a neighborhood like Capitol Hill, where there's a lot of this sort of thing going on, where there's been some subdivision and there are independent dwelling units in the existing structure, and you've got 2 of them in one structure. Probably they're permitted as primary dwelling units. And if that's the case, then all of the short-term rental rules that go along with primary dwelling units apply to each of the dwelling units just like they would to anything else. And that's where we get to, you can't actually live in one of them and short-term rent the other, because that's just another whole dwelling unit. It would be treated exactly the same way for zoning purposes as if you lived in an apartment building or a condo building, let's say with 300 units, and you lived in one and proposed to short-term rent the other. Same thing, basically. However, in this situation where there's just 2 units in this, what is it otherwise, just a big existing house, perhaps it would be possible to actually re-permit the other unit, if you owned both of them, as an accessory dwelling unit. And then you're creating a relationship between the 2 units. If the other unit could meet all the conditions that it would need to meet, it's not too big, there's various other limitations on it, it could hypothetically be permitted as an accessory dwelling unit, in which case then everything we kind of focused on last time about short-term rentals and accessory dwelling units applies, which is that you in fact could live in one of the units and short-term rent the other. So I know it really just comes down to how something has been permitted, and that there is this situation in which something maybe could have been permitted 2 different ways. Like you described. Other situations like that big condo building one I described, like there would just be no way to permit another unit in there as an accessory dwelling unit. Does that help?
To some degree, yes. I guess the idea that comes to mind is, let's say you live in an apartment building or a condo building, and you own your own, let's say 1,000 square foot unit, and next door is a 500 square foot studio, and you decide to buy it and you put a door between the 2 units. Then suddenly you can, I guess it's where are the lines, and the idea that something has to be permitted a certain way seems like a pretty solid demarcating line. But I guess it's just where, for those of us who do this for a living and help other people ensure that they can, whether it's afford their house or utilize property that they own, whatever the case is, sort of what is this, what's the right line? What's the right line to draw? And outside the ADU, or I guess sort of as an ADU, some things aren't permitted as an ADU, or I definitely know people who have a part of their house that's lock off, that isn't, it may have a kitchenette or something like that, which doesn't require the separate permit. Does that sort of just fall under, hey, it's a single unit, we don't really care that there's a door separating them, the fact is it all functions legally as one unit? I guess I'm not putting this in a question very well, but.
Well, I think it's obviously complicated, which is why we have so many questions about this and talk about it so much. We tried to draw the clearest line we could, and I still feel like we basically drew the line in the clearest place we could have, but it's challenging. And it's really just, then you get into the questions about, well, what really is a dwelling unit versus there's just a sink there, or, there's a bathroom available for a bedroom. So in the lock-off situation, if the lock-off includes things that don't qualify it doesn't cross the line into being an independent dwelling unit, meaning it has a sleeping area, a kitchen, and a bathroom, then it's just part of that same primary dwelling unit. If it does have all of the things that can make it its own dwelling unit, in order to be legal, it would have had to have been permitted through a different path, probably as an accessory dwelling unit. In your example where you had two condos and you owned them both and you create a door between them, I think that actually, they both meet the definition of a complete dwelling unit because they're each going to have a whole kitchen and a bathroom and sleeping quarters. They'd really have to be treated as two separate dwelling units, even if you technically could walk between them, unless you removed one of the components that made one of them a dwelling unit from it.
Okay, that makes sense. That being said, I know over in Hilltop within the relatively, I'm Jewish, but not, I'm not Orthodox. Plenty of Orthodox people have two separate kitchens in their house for religious reasons. And I've been wondering, how does that fit if a kitchen, particularly if they are on different sides of the house and you could potentially lock them off, like just from an academic perspective, how does that work?
Yeah, I may not be able to give you a perfect answer on that. I actually was wondering about that a little bit myself. There are a lot of gray area conditions where you've added most or nearly all of what really could be its own dwelling unit. Like there's two whole kitchens, plus there's at least two bathrooms in a unit. Doesn't that make it two different units? There is some distinctions that can be made that I don't understand well enough to give you the greatest answer, other than to say that there are some ways to enable what you're talking about as a single dwelling unit. But I would say it's not a situation in which one really can be completely separated from the other as if it were another dwelling unit. It's just a house with two kitchens.
Abe, would the address of a dwelling unit or an accessory dwelling unit make a difference? Because I know when you take out a permit, they ask you what address you would like. And I saw today that they're doing the initial address, but calling it 1/2 instead of giving it a whole new numeral. How does that work between permitting and the future of an ADU and its use?
Well, I think whether or not something has a different address is just a separate addressing question. But we do try to sync things up as much as possible, just for clarity's sake, that when you create something that is an independent dwelling unit, whether it's a primary dwelling unit or an accessory dwelling unit, that it get its own address. To clarify that, whether it's a 1/2 address or not is just up to the addressing folks.
So can I ask for a clarification? If someone owned a duplex and wanted to use one side as a short-term rental unit, they could come to you and ask to get it re-permitted? And then if they met all the requirements, then it could be used as an ADU that they could use as a short-term rental?
Yes. So the key is, can it meet all the requirements?
Can you send out the requirements or post them someplace that everybody can find them?
Yeah. So that's going to be the zoning limitations on the accessory dwelling unit use. So there's a square footage cap. There's some other more nuanced things about not appearing to have a separate entrance when viewed from the street, which is one of the reasons why the scenario in which it's just an existing house that was divided up into different dwelling units, it seems a little easier than if it were just the sort of classic duplex where each of the units, basically is its own independent thing with its own exterior entrance.
Huh. And by the same token, if you put an ADU, a tiny house right next to your house, and there was an entrance to, that you could see from the street, that wouldn't be allowable as a short-term rental. Is that right?
Well, I mean, you first have to ask, like, isn't it an accessory dwelling unit? And it is if it's its own dwelling unit and was permitted as an accessory dwelling unit, which would have been the only way to permit it in a single unit district. And in order to get that permit, it shouldn't have an entrance that you can like readily see from the street. Whether you can see it if you like look through the bushes or not, I don't know. But then, you know, if it's an accessory dwelling unit, then yes, all of the rules about short-term renting an accessory dwelling unit apply, which is that you can do it basically if you live in the house.
Thank you.
Question. One of the things that we haven't talked about very much is classic duplexes often are built on a split lot. And if someone owned both of them, and I think we had a question about that sometime in the past, and wanted to use one as their primary residence and the other side as an ADU, it probably shouldn't be permitted, correct? Because there are zone lots?
Well,
Or a split zone lot?
yeah, I mean, of course, zone lots can be amended as well. So something can be placed on the same zone lot if it can meet all the rules. Did we, it looks like Nina's question got moved to answered in the chat. Is that right?
Let me hop in. So the way it's going to work is that the Q&A is for members of the public who want to submit questions. I am monitoring those so that you guys can focus on your questions and answers first. And then we have a system on the back end for making sure that we are either answering questions that don't deal with accessory dwelling units or saving them to the end after the committee's done with their questions. So sorry if that was unclear.
No problem. So I'll just rely on you to let us know when it's time to move on to those.
This is Erin. I have a question for you. I'd like to, or maybe we could revisit. I want a better understanding around the size constraints that dictates primary residence versus not. And I'm curious about that just in the light of a kind of a continuum of housing concept in a number of instances. I can use my own property as an example, but have a number of colleagues that kind of are in the same boat. Whereas, you know, we currently own a big house because it's full of children ourselves, and eventually those children will leave. We've contemplated adding an ADU to the back. I understand from, you know, our previous conversations that I'd be able to license that ADU as a short-term rental. But my thought would be, over the years, I certainly don't need a gigantic home for two people, and that my husband and I would move into the ADU and then we'd rent out the house. Is it that the main part of the house could not be rented out because that's considered the primary residence on the property? Is that correct?
That's correct. So unless you lived there, but I think the scenario you're talking about is you'd move to the ADU and want to short-term rent the primary residence, which wouldn't be allowed under current regulations. And we talked about that in detail last time, and mostly having to do with it's really hard to then consider rental of the main house as being an accessory use as opposed to the primary use of the property. And short-term rentals is by definition an accessory use.
It's an interesting, and I think that that's an interesting designation and definition, and it's a strong fact pattern, but I do think it's worthy of discussing the flexibility that aging in place and flexibility in building types for accommodating people as family structures change. That's, you know, certainly there are ways, you know, you can just long-term rent your house, you know, that type of approach, those types of things. But I do think that something that is often missed in some of the considerations around short-term rentals have to do with the ability to keep people in their homes and in their communities. And so there's plenty of conversation about, the impact on affordable housing and concerns of that front. And I think that those are all laudable things for us to continue to investigate and watch. But I think we often miss some of the components of the flexibility of the use of the property, allowing the individual who's already there or people to stay in their communities by being able to use it slightly differently. And so my parents, for example, are able to stay in their house because we short-term rent, well, up until COVID, we short-term rented their basement and help offset their mortgage payments. And so just there's many of these different kind of permutations as people age and change and children leave home. And I think that those should be taken into consideration about how we look at all of these aspects of regulation.
I'd like to chime in on this, if I may, Abe.
Sure.
When I was on, and a couple other members were on the initial short-term rental committee, we always looked at ways that people would use this flexibility to circumvent what is best for the neighborhoods. And I just wanted to inject that circumventing seems to be is on a lot of people's mind. And for me, let's just take circumventing the rules off the table. That's it. Next.
Sure, right. So there's, on the one hand, we're talking about what the rules are. And then, of course, there's some ideas about just thinking regarding the future. And I think, we're definitely thinking about all of those things, that doing short-term rentals is maybe a way to stay in your home as you age and things change in your life. On the other hand, there's concern about taking units off of the long-term market when we're in desperate need of housing, and maybe some idea that in fact long-term renting could also help you stay in your house. So we need to balance all of those things.
Yeah, I think, George, in response to your comment, mine is merely recognizing that this is a really new industry, and the reason our committee exists is that as we're going through this process and understanding how the existing regulations actually fit or don't fit with the zoning code, and how the regulations may fit or don't work well within the market, all of those scenarios, and many of our regulations do fit well within the market and do fit well with the zoning code. But this is a live situation that requires, I think, persistent review and update, as opposed to assuming the original committee, as you put it, has laid down the law of the land, and that's the law that should stay in place from here until eternity, when we're evaluating the impacts of a new industry that heretofore we've never dealt with. And so the concept of circumventing, I think, is interesting, because really it's more a matter of discussing the dynamics of a new regulation on a new industry.
I understand where you're coming from, Aaron, but if you'll notice that we still have almost half of the number of short-term rentals are still not licensed. Look at the numbers. I know it's coming down, and excise and licensing is doing a wonderful job on that. But it has always been my opinion that if there's a way to circumvent, people will. So as long as I'm on this committee, I will make sure that circumventing is not the rule of law. Okay, next.
So I don't see anyone with their hand up, but again, this is just a Q&A. We're just here to learn more about the rules as they are. Any discussions about anything different, we can talk about at STRAC, but this is focused on making sure you get the answers to your questions.
I do have a question again. Abe, how does this fit in with the group amendment that's coming down? Is there any limitation on the number of people you can rent in an ADU to, or how does that fit or not fit?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I mean, one interesting thing is that, well, as those of you who have been watching the group living project know, for a long time there have been limits on the number of long-term inhabitants of a dwelling unit. And the group living project has proposed some amendments to that. The short-term rental regulations, interestingly, don't specifically say that there's a limit on the number of guests. And perhaps excise and licenses can jump in on, whether they see some situations in which they've had to kind of step in with larger guest numbers. But my memory of the discussion leading up to the regulations was that, there definitely, not surprisingly, was an interest in including limitations like that, like no more than 2 guests, no more than 5 guests, whatever it is. But that ultimately we'd heard from other communities that had adopted rules like that, that they found it impossible to enforce them. And so instead, we were silent on it and basically rely on the other rules, including the primary resident rule, to kind of keep things, relatively more under control in terms of that. But that does end up in a situation where you have limits on the number of people that are living there, like permanently, and no specific limits on short-term rental guests.
I thought we did have a short-term rental guest limit that was something like no more than 2 people per bedroom plus 2 additional people, or something like that. Am I the only one who remembers something like that? Maybe
I believe we talked about it once, but I don't remember.
Yeah, I think that was the metric that was floated with the intent that those would be 2 data points that could be measured by our third party. Can't remember what they are. The folks that give us all the metrics if it's licensed and not, in the sense that bedrooms are identified as part of the assessor's process, and then that could be linked to the data field of number of guests allowed in the rental. But again, it came down to how enforceable is that. No one's going to knock on the door at 9 o'clock and do a head count.
Right.
Maybe something we may be addressing in the future.
I'm sorry, what was that, George?
I said that may be something that we may be addressing in the future. In my case, I had a baseball team next door to me, 3-bedroom house, and it was 12 or 14 guys. Now, see, that's what drove this whole thing in 2009. So we may be looking at addressing, as Buffy brought up, 2 people per bed or et cetera, plus, because now that the group living initiative is coming into process, we're talking 8 adults and unlimited children. So that's unattainable in neighborhoods. So anyway, that's for another discussion. Thanks, Buffy, for bringing that up.
Yeah, thanks, Buffy. And then just back to, I didn't really answer the question on group living regarding the relationship. We're talking about the number of people that might be in an individual dwelling unit. So of course there is a relationship there, but the group living proposal doesn't change anything specifically about short-term rentals. If adopted as it stands now, it would just increase the number of long-term residents that you could have in a dwelling unit in a lower scale residential neighborhood without changing anything about short-term rentals.
I have a question for you, Abe. I'm curious about kind of the history of zoning generally in the U.S. and also in Denver, because it seems like things that George brings up all come from local communities, basically, because that's what his organization is concerned with. And it seems like that's where the basis for zoning decisions should lie, there and in our representative government, the city council. But it seems like some things are being brought to us more by, well, the city needs this or that, not by the people who live in those areas, but like with the group living and the idea about how do we do ADUs and do we want them do we want to restrict their use to long-term so that they meet the affordable housing need instead of letting people who want to have ADUs and use them in certain ways? I just wonder whether I'm all off with thinking that zoning is more local and neighborhood driven, or if it's just kind of we're doing things differently now.
Well, I think there's a combination of, you know, citywide considerations and local considerations. And I think sometimes some of the confusion happens in just how long-term a lot of these projects are, because, you know, very often what's happened is that there's a long-term like planning project, like the Denver Right project, and which Blueprint Denver was part of, which has like a lot of community consultation, ultimately then leads to recommendations that city council adopts. Then those recommendations feed into projects like group living or other projects that ultimately propose zoning changes. And then those zoning changes have to go to city council for approval. But basically, you know, the way that we are trying to do things is that we are gathering information from communities to lead into those recommendations, oftentimes over the course of years, discussing those with city council. They go through city council, then we move into a project that is the what does that specifically mean on the ground, and then that goes to city council. So city council, you know, of course, is ultimately making the final decision on all of these things. And we are doing a lot of community consultation about it. One of the challenges is, you know, whether we are doing everything on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, whatever you mean by neighborhood, like literally the statistical neighborhoods or by some other definition, or whether there are things that are more broadly about the city. And I think at least for us planning professionals, there are a lot of things that we really feel like we need to look at citywide for equity purposes. And a lot of the questions around housing really fall into that category. Because if we do everything on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, we have some neighborhoods that say absolutely no to any new housing, or to short-term rentals for that matter, or other things, let's say. And then the burden of meeting citywide objectives around housing affordability and equity all falls on everywhere else, essentially, at that point. And so we really can't do equitable planning in, you know, for some of those bigger issues if we literally are only looking at it on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. So in those cases, I think it has to be something of both. Does that help, Buffy?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we know kind of what's driving the decision-making process, and that kind of explains it some.
I have a question. I don't know if you can see my hand raised with the Zoom platform, but this is Dana Lubner. And I was curious if you, Abe, or anybody on the committee knows the total number of long-term rental properties or units that we have available in the city, or where there may be a good resource to get this data?
So that's a good question. We don't have a great answer, I think, because we don't license long-term rentals. So if you were to actually just put your house up for rent and rent it out to somebody, and you moved to Florida or wherever, we wouldn't even know in the city. And so therefore, it's pretty hard for us to track that. You wanted to jump in, George?
Yeah, from the statistics that we've encountered over the last couple of years, Denver is about 50-50. 50% homeowners,
that's right.
50% renters. So it's 1 or 2 percentage sides either side.
Yeah, I think that's about right. But the exact numbers we don't know for sure.
Was that your question, Dana?
Yes.
Dana, was that your question? Was around long-term rentals?
Yes, just wanting to know if it is something we can track, and, you know, how is it something that we are tracking to determine that it is 50-50? Just because I know one of the one of the narratives we hear a lot is that there is a shortage of long-term rentals. And so I just was curious, since they aren't licensed or regulated, how that conclusion is discovered or come upon.
I think it's more about there's a shortage of housing in general. And, just looking at the number of people coming into the area versus the production of housing. And then, of course, when you look at the relationship between changes in housing prices and changes in income.
And does that long-term rental classified, like all the condo buildings that we see popping up, those constitute, if they are apartments, as long-term rentals?
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
Those are long-term rentals. And so anecdotally, I think the mix has shifted a little bit more towards rental from ownership. I don't know exactly how much. Have you read anything about that, George? Mostly because, all these new buildings are mostly rental that you see going up.
Thank you.
That's a good question, Abe. We'll look into that. Thank you for bringing that up.
Abe, I have another question. It seems that the assessor's office is in conflict with actual zoning. Well, I shouldn't say it that way. The assessor's office is in conflict with what the building is actually used for, the residence is used for. For instance, my home originally was broken in, it's an old Capitol Hill home. It was broken into apartments. And 20 years ago, we turned it over into a primary residence. But the assessor's office has never acknowledged that it's gone into a single family. We had an assessor's person inspect the home this last protesting period. And he said the highest use of a sale of yours, which is called a conversion home, is to keep it as a multifamily. But what that does, and I don't know if you follow the assessor's office, but what that does is preclude a person like me from having a short-term rental in an ADU because it's showing that there are 4 separate rental units. So does that mean that a person that has that situation needs to go back to CPD and get it re-permitted so that the assessor's office doesn't look at it as a multifamily dwelling?
Boy, that's a complicated one, Cindy. So you're living in it as your home, but it essentially has what could be several units in it, or they used to be.
It used to be, and now what we have is like a grandmother's apartment, is what the assessor's office calls it. So there's a garden level, full kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, living area. And he says, because you have that, we're still going to look at it as a multifamily dwelling because the way we haven't remodeled it yet, and it's still broken up upstairs into what could possibly be 2 separate units upstairs also. So they're stretching it, and it just seems like they don't have any limitations to what they can designate a, quote, conversion house, that they call it. Mm-hmm. This was a gentleman in the assessor's office who was an expert in the old homes, he said. So I'm just wondering how you rectify that situation and not let an assessor dictate how you're going to use your own home when you're using it differently.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I don't really know the answer, but I'm curious as to whether re-permitting through CPD, just as a single dwelling unit or as a primary dwelling unit with an accessory dwelling unit, the mother-in-law's apartment, would be a trigger that the assessor's office would recognize to reclassify it. And I guess that question probably would go best to the assessor's office first, because that's what you want. You want them to reclassify it because your taxes will go down, right?
Right. Right. And what he said is that there had to be a remodeling process. But I know another gentleman that lives in Congress Park that he had his home as a short-term rental. And once he reapplied, he was turned down because his home had shown that it was in an apartment kind of situation, and he had separate addresses. It wasn't really a duplex, it was an ADU situation.
Mm-hmm.
So I know it affects a lot of people, and I just wondered what CPD's process would be for those people affected by that to be able to do a short-term rental if they really wanted to do one.
Right. Boy. So yeah, I mean, if something really is classified as a separate dwelling unit, but it's in what you're treating as your house, then technically it's a different dwelling unit and you can't do the short-term rental there.
Right.
If you got it reclassified so that it was one dwelling unit or one dwelling unit and one accessory dwelling unit, then you could. But I think there's a possibility that it would be hard to reclassify if it really is still kind of set up to be separate dwelling units. You just are living in all of them at once, kind of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So for the advice for other people is to re-permit with CPD because of the new use. How would you go against the assessor's office that I don't think he has a lot of basis in what he's saying?
I think that the right path is to re-permit as just one primary dwelling unit, but I would check with the assessor first to make sure that that's gonna work as a trigger for them.
Mm-hmm. So are you
I
saying
would sure
the
hope it
assessor's
would.
office? Yeah. Are you saying the assessor's office rules trump the CPD rules? I'm sorry, I shouldn't use that word.
Well, when it comes to taxes, yes. So if the primary concern is taxes, then you just want to make sure that they're actually going to recognize that it's not a multi-unit development so that you can get the favorable tax change. If it's about short-term rentals and all the other things that the zoning code regulates, then definitely if you were able to reclassify it as a primary dwelling unit, then we're going to treat it that way. It doesn't matter what the assessor says. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we've got about 15 minutes left. I don't see any STRAC members with their hand up. So if it's okay with the...
Hi, Erica, it's Susan. Sorry,
Hi.
I don't think I was knowing where to click to put my hand up. So
That's
sorry
okay.
about that.
All right, go for it.
I have one question, and it is related to one that I sent you an email on, and I understand you guys are completely slammed. But it's a little different than all the things you've heard thus far. One thing you referenced in our last meeting was the ability to do a zone lot amendment. And I think this scenario, kind of like Cindy's, is a unique one. So I'm helping a couple and their daughter renovate a little house they have in the Regis neighborhood. It's called Berkeley on our plat maps, but it's really Regis, like 51st and Meade. And they have a house in front and they have a little garage in the back. And it was converted, I'm going to guess 20 or 30 years ago. It has a gas heater, it has electrical, it has water. And so they want to do the right thing and permit it as an ADU. It's quite small, like 250 or 300 square feet. But they were denied a second address, as I mentioned to you before, because even though many lots on their street are zoned C1, that allows them to have an ADU, and their lot size is 6250, So it's above 5,500 or 5,000. Looks, I've seen both numbers, but I believe 5,500 is the threshold square in terms of lot square footage. But they want to go through the entire ADU process. And I guess my question is twofold. One is there someone in zoning that can take a call the way the city is currently set up with everyone working remotely, or reply to an email so that someone can look at their case uniquely, because they basically they send notes, they fill out documents, and they get kind of nowhere. So I guess that's the first question is, really going through the right steps for a zone lot amendment so that if their lot could be rezoned, like many on their street, to allow that back unit to be a legitimate ADU. They've already done a site survey, so then they would do the locates for all the utilities, et cetera. So that's, I guess, part one for having you help us answer. And part two is, I wonder as a city, if we can think about backyard cottage conversions as different than a brand new build on an ADU. Because it seems to me that we charge the same fees as a city, regardless of whether someone has torn something down and they're building kind of a large ADU, perhaps over a garage or a new building, versus a cottage or a former garage that somebody else had done some of the work on and they're going to bring up to code, and it's an existing structure. And in reading through our deep documentation on ADUs in the community planning department, it seems like we have a one-size-fits-all model, and we don't have this model that many other cities have that take an existing structure and bring it up to code, even if you have to have frost barrier concrete and all of those things. So I guess question number one is, how do we navigate the team in zoning so that someone can help these people who very much want to do the right thing and permit what kind of already somebody probably bootlegged, that was non-permitted in the past. And then secondly, are we thinking about, in this broader zoning initiative, a lot of the things that came up on this call, coupled with this kind of scenario, shouldn't there be a lower cost way for someone to do a backyard cottage conversion, which is what Seattle and Portland call it, versus a brand new ADU build? And I see no evidence that we have that distinction.
We don't have that distinction. So I'll start with your part two first. But there's a lot of talk about how we need to be thinking differently about that. And so there's policy direction in Blueprint Denver to both extend allowances for accessory dwelling units citywide. So once that implementation project that's kind of slowly moving forward finishes with a zoning proposal, the proposal will include some version of saying, actually, regardless of which zone district you're in, there's some way of doing an accessory dwelling unit, whether it's attached or detached. That's part of it. The Blueprint Denver also says that we should be, while remaining very sensitive to the design of detached units being contextually sensitive, removing the barriers that prevent them from happening, because there really is only a fairly small trickle of them being built or converted right now. And a lot of the barriers that we hear about relate to some of the things you're talking about, and other things like, for example, when you add an accessory dwelling unit in the back of your lot, it's like new, it's very expensive, and that triggers all kinds of requirements from our infrastructure folks about fixing your sidewalks and all of these things. And so there's definitely discussion about finding a little bit more nuance that makes it possible to take opportunities that might otherwise be pretty inexpensive if we could get some of our own requirements out of the way. Does that help with part two, at least?
Yeah, it really does. And if we had an ability to actually act on it and maybe look at best practices from other cities that have been doing it in zoning like us for a few years, maybe we could, your team or the team working on this could look at that as a mechanism by which to integrate into this broader zoning proposal.
Yeah, sounds good. So then part one, I think, so it sounds like the situation is the person is in a zone district that doesn't allow accessory dwelling units right now, right?
The zone district does, but their individual lot is not zoned for it for some reason.
Well, so they need to rezone if they're in a zone. So technically they're in a zone district that doesn't allow it if their lot isn't zoned to allow it,
Okay.
right? So there's a rezoning involved, and I think the first step is to fill out rezoning pre-application, and I'll put a link to the web page in the chat if I can figure out how to do that. But it's like a real simple application. It's like, I'm interested in rezoning. Here's what I think I want to rezone to. You don't really have to provide that many details.
Okay.
And what it triggers is, it gets assigned to a person in CPD who within about a week contacts you and sets up a meeting to talk about it. I think if there's some reason to think that the zone lot needs to be amended as well, or there are other considerations, they could throw that onto the form just to make sure that the meeting includes somebody that knows about that stuff.
Okay.
And then that person then that meets with them remains their case manager, if they decide to apply for submit a formal rezoning application, and then can walk them through that.
Got it. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, so Abe, I want to circle back to a question that we received from Nina in the Q&A that we wanted to address since we're nearing the end of our time. Nina asks, if ADUs are approved for a neighborhood which doesn't currently allow them, will the zoning and building code with setbacks, height, size limits, etc., be the same as neighborhoods currently zoned for ADUs?
This is probably why I was trying to answer this question earlier, is that it's a pretty easy one. The answer is yes.
Okay.
Good enough? Basically, if you rezone into a district that allows ADUs, you're in the same place as anyone that already has it, basically.
Great. Another question that it looks like we've got a couple different versions of from the public. Can you just recap the zoning guidance that talks about living in the ADU versus the main use dwelling unit on the property?
Yeah, and before I do that, do you know, Erica, if there's a way I can just put things in a chat stream that people see, the link to the rezoning information, or
well,
I can just...
I enabled a Q&A. I don't think I have a chat turned on because I'm not great with technology, but if you send it to me via email, I'll make sure it gets included when we publish our recap of this meeting with all the questions and answers and resources so that anyone watching can access that.
Okay, that sounds great. And then to the question was just a recap of the rules around short-term rentals and ADUs. To simplify, it comes down to, if you live in the primary dwelling unit, you can conduct a short-term rental in that primary dwelling unit or in a permitted accessory dwelling unit, whether it's a basement apartment, that's an attached accessory dwelling unit, or a permitted detached accessory dwelling unit. The other situation where you're the primary resident of an accessory dwelling unit, you cannot conduct a short-term rental in the primary dwelling unit. And there's a whole series of technical reasons, but I think philosophically, the main reason is that we're treating short-term rentals as an accessory use, and that kind of goes along with the primary resident requirement. It's something that you do in addition to living in a place full-time. And when the situation is, you're living in the cottage in the backyard and short-term renting the primary residence, maybe every night of the year, that's no longer really treating short-term rentals as an accessory use of the property. Most people would see that as that's actually would be the primary use. So it's not presently allowed.
Great, thank you, Abe. Well, it looks like we're approaching, it's 4:57, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Do any of the other STRAC members have a final question? It looks like Sabrina has her hand raised.
Hi. So I just wanted to go back to the number of long-term renters. I feel like that's an important piece of information. And I know that we did that study that we came up with between 1% and 4% of short-term renters took over the housing in Denver. So I'm curious if we can come to a conclusion on that number. Is that possible? It seems like you could just with mailing addresses related to the primary residence where they're getting their mail.
Not quite sure I understand the question.
I guess more for my committee, I think that that seems like a valuable thing to have, is to know exactly if that's 50-50 or 40-60 or whatever that looks like. But with your department, it seems like we have that information, or we could narrow that down.
That's something I can follow up on. There may be some techniques and there may be some estimate that I'm not aware of that's more precise than this broad 50-50 thing. I know that we're challenged to come to an exact number on how many things are rentals versus not rentals. And there's always been this kind of bubbling discussion about whether we should be licensing long-term rentals, which a lot of other cities do, in which case we could tell you exactly how many licenses there are. But let me follow up on that. And if I can find any good information, I'll give that to Erica to provide. And then it's something you all can continue to discuss as well.
Thank you.
And just so you know, Sabrina, and I'm sure Abe, you're aware that I know that there's a Councilwoman Gilmore, who has been looking at other cities that license long-term rentals and gathering information. So she may be aware of a way to collect that data for Denver. So I will reach out to her and see if I can provide that in a follow-up as well.
That's great. Yes.
There was one other question that was in the Q&A that I think got skipped over, which is, what is the purpose of the square footage limitation? And I was wondering.
That is, so the square footage limitation is only on accessory dwelling units. Like this is not a short-term rental thing. And I was not around at the time that the accessory dwelling unit regulations were put into place. They go back quite a ways. But reading them, I think it's quite clear that there was a very potentially tense community conversation about accessory dwelling units, and a lot of concern, probably some of it a little similar to what we heard in the conversation about short-term rentals, that allowances for accessory dwelling units would change the nature of neighborhoods. And so when you look at the kinds of limitations that are in there about ADUs, and I'll send a reference to that part of the code to Erica as well, to the other question, what it looks like to me is that there was a real interest in ensuring that those units were really subordinate to the houses, essentially, that they really were basement apartments or cottages in the back, as opposed to a whole nother dwelling unit, just like the house. Does that make sense?
Yeah, as opposed to, let's say, a tandem house housing form or something like that.
Right, and that is just two different dwelling units, and they can each be just as the same size.
This was brought up in the 2010 rezoning. We had that, where neighborhoods, and it was contentious at the time, could opt in or opt out of ADUs. So that was an interesting time.
Yeah, the one thing that I find interesting about that specific square footage limitation is that it doesn't really dictate the actual use of an ADU. Like in downtown, you can definitely find a 1,500 square foot studio condo, and my friends just bought an 800 square foot 3-bedroom 2-bathroom house in the city of Denver. So it's sort of like, mean, you can fit 2 bedrooms in 640 square feet or 4 bedrooms in 1,000 square foot ADU, but it's sort of, yeah, a little.
Right. You could argue that it's the wrong tool, but I think it's trying to get at, let's just make sure that this is the lesser of the 2 units on the property, essentially.
Abe, could you please give the timeline of the infill discussion, the infill project?
Yeah, a good question. We talked about that a little bit last time, that, you know, we're looking at a project to actually implement the already adopted Blueprint Denver recommendations that talk about accessory dwelling units citywide, that talk about additional housing options, as well as like looking really closely at our design regulations in residential neighborhoods. The project has been moving slowly towards a kind of more public kickoff. But I think, you know, and one of the reasons it's moving so slowly is there is a lot of, I think, legitimate concern about all the conversations that are going on right now, especially group living. There's, you know, a lot of opinions and plenty of controversy about those proposals, that it's challenging to think about all of these things at the same time. And so we are right now kind of revisiting what the schedule really should look like for the residential infill project in light of that. Regardless of exactly when it really begins rolling forward, we think it's going to take 2 years from that point to actually any sort of zoning adoption, because even though we have adopted policy that says, you know, ADU should be allowed in more places, and that we ought to be looking at opportunities for other kinds of housing in lower scale residential neighborhoods, it's not specific. It doesn't say exactly what, where, and how. And we need to have a lot of conversation about that, and a lot of people need to weigh in. And, you know, there are going to be folks that are really gung-ho about the additional housing, and there are going to be folks that are really concerned about it, and we need to navigate that.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Abe. I think that's a great time to wrap it up. It is about 4 minutes after 5. So this is going to be recorded. And so as soon as I can get it transmitted, I can have it posted on our STRAC website. There will also be a written Q&A document that outlines all the questions and answers from the last STRAC meeting, submitted via email and this session. So I will send that around as well and post it on our website. If anyone has any additional questions that they thought of in the last hour, please do feel free to send those to us at licenses@denvergov.org. Without further ado, then, I guess I'll let everyone go. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks, Erica.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Abe.
Thank you.